Good afternoon, everybody. You can tell we back out cotton field yet again, where we spend a large part of our summer. Got all of our pigweed fighting tools back to the side by side. We're going around the fields looking for any stragglers of pigweeds, making sure we remove them, and checking the stage of the cotton, seeing how far along it is. If you've been following us this year, you know we've had nothing but problems out of our cotton crop. You know, ever since planting, got off to a rough start and just really hadn't had a chance to catch up this year, and ultimately, most likely, probably not looking like a real good cotton crop. Now, this week, the cotton has done some catching up. We've had a really hot week, highs around 95, lows around 74. So we've been picking up between 23, 25 DD60s a day, every day this week, which is really good, but ultimately we need quite a few weeks of weather like that, and right now we're at the end of August. The heat's still here, but you know, historically probably not going to be here very much longer. So looking at the cotton crop, I mean, it looks good, but it's just so far behind. It should have looked this way 2 to 3 weeks ago. You know, we're just now starting to get blooms up in the top part of the plant, and like I said, we should have seen that a couple of weeks ago. But you know, this bloom right here, not gonna make anything. This down here that bloomed 3 days before that, not gonna make anything. This bloom right here that bloomed 6 days before that, probably not gonna make anything. So we gotta go down here. Well, there's not even a square on this branch right here. So we gotta go on down in the plant. There's another branch that doesn't have a square on it. Gotta go way down the plant to find something that might actually make something. And those 2 branches I showed you didn't have anything on it. That's another problem that we came into, finally determined the cause this week. The overnight hours of July 31st, August 1st had an extremely severe storm come through here. Really a narrow band where it was most severe, but it hit pretty much all of our farm ground where it's most severe. We saw in excess of probably 70-mile-an-hour winds, really tasseled the cotton about real bad, and the cotton plant thought it was under severe stress from that brief event, and we think that the cotton produced a flush of ethylene, which is a cotton hormone, and caused it to shed the topmost fruit on the plant at that time, which at that time was those branches. So those branches that would have likely made the last significant fruit that we would have been able to harvest that would actually contribute to yield, the plant actually kicked that fruit off, and it's over all of our cotton crop, doesn't matter variety or location, because all of our cotton is right here in a narrow band between our shop and Jackson, and that's where the 70-mile-an-hour winds hit. So not only did our cotton start flowering extremely late this year, you know, we also got 2 branches there that were affected by that event. So even though cotton looks good right now, I mean, it's going to take 90-degree days all the way into the first part of October to hopefully make a halfway decent yield. But anyway, it's still a long ways off. You know, cotton still got a long ways to go. And cotton typically surprises me every single year, either good or bad. My expectation right now is pretty low, so really not going to do anything else to disappoint me as far as yield. So all I can do is be pleasantly surprised. But we won't know that for at least a month and a half. So anyway, that's an update on my cotton crop. Let's get to the questions. That's what you're here to watch anyway. We're going to take a break away from the heat, stay here in the shade here for just a minute, see if we can get through, say, another 5 questions or so. All right, we're down to the last 2 questions from our original video when we announced this series, so we'll get those finished up and then we'll move on to the next video. First question is from EOTL Farm. She asks, is it easy to operate a tractor? Why don't I see you cultivate the fields? Well, to answer the second part of your question first, I've addressed this extensively in previous videos on Ask the Farmer. You know, we're strictly 100% no-till. We're trying to build our soil structure up. We believe that that promotes the healthiest, most drought-resistant, most pest-resistant crops by building up the soil and letting our crops grow in a more natural environment. Anytime you plow the soil, it loosens the soil up. It destroys organic matter, destroys microbial life, and you know, basically turns the soil, which is living, breathing entity, into mineral particles known as dirt. So a whole different ecosystem down there that we want to build up and thrive. We think it really helps promote the plants, and it helps them survive and flourish during adverse conditions. To get more in depth on that, go back and check out some of my earliest videos. I think the third video on Ask a Farmer, I addressed it most in depth. First part of your question is it easy to operate a tractor? And well, I mean, to me it is, but I mean, I've been driving tractors all my life. Just like if you were to ask a truck driver, is it easy to drive a truck? They'd probably say, yeah, because that's what they've been doing a long time. They've had extensive training. The more you do a certain thing, the easier it gets. That being said, I mean, you got two different types of drivers. You got an actual farm equipment operator, and then you got a steering wheel holder. And the steering wheel holder, all they do is drive the tractor through the field, really not paying attention to much what's going on behind them, whether the machine's doing a good job or whatever. They just making the tractor move back and forth. Whereas what farmers actually need is an operator, someone who's actually operating the equipment, who's paying attention to all of the details. Say if you're pulling a planter, watching the monitors, making sure that it's putting seed in the ground, making sure nothing's locked up on the planter, nothing's plugged up, stuff like that. If you're operating a combine or a cotton picker, you're listening to the machine, making sure everything sounds like it should, making sure the grain's clean, making sure you're optimizing throughput through the machine. So, with training, it's not really difficult to operate a tractor, but there are a lot of things that you need to look out for to maximize your equipment, make sure you don't tear anything up, make sure your equipment is doing the job properly, and making sure that you're maximizing productivity. Again, it just it comes with experience, and you use all of your senses when driving a tractor. Your eyesight, your hearing, your feel vibrations through the seat or in the steering wheel that maybe tell you if something's a little bit off. You smell something burning, or just something that's or smelling something that's just a little off, that's not normal. So, and here in the last 20 years, as technology has advanced, tractors have become more user friendly, which has allowed us to pay more attention to the equipment that we're operating behind. Now we've got auto steer. So when you're in a field like this, you can set your auto steer and you don't have to worry about following the row or following a straight line. The computer's doing that for you, so say if I'm planting in a straight line, I don't have to worry about steering. I can pay more attention to the planter behind me, making sure that I'm paying attention to it, and I can catch a little bit sooner, if something is to go wrong with it. A lot of our transmissions, a lot of our hydraulics, instead of being manually operated, are now electronically activated. So, in the past, driving a tractor might have been physically harder. Years ago, we didn't have a radio, we didn't have a cab, we didn't have AC, and it was, you're out on the tractor in the elements, which can be a lot more physically demanding of you, and might lead you to maybe not pay as close attention to the equipment behind you. So, anyway, hope that answers your question. Next question is from Asherlito. Sorry if I didn't pronounce that right. And he asks, how does your cover crop system work? Do you have dual growing seasons? Do you crop rotate or something else? Well, Asherlito, we plant our cover crops in between our cash crops. Our cover crops are growing during the winter months when our summer crops are not growing. Our typical crop rotation for the majority of our ground is the first year will be corn, second year will be cotton, and the third year will be wheat and double crop soybeans. When we'll usually have a cover crop in between the corn and the cotton crop, and after the cotton crop, we'll plant winter wheat. In place of a cover crop, we'll use a winter wheat as a cash crop, then double crop soybeans behind that winter wheat, and then we'll plant a cover crop behind that double crop soybeans before we plant corn the next year. So basically 2 out of 3 years we'll have a cover crop on the ground, and that third year we'll have winter wheat growing. So our goal in our cover crop system is to have something growing on the ground, whether it be a cover crop or a cash crop, to have living roots in the ground year round. Well, basically 11 months out of the year, because there's usually about a month there where the cash crop is dying before we can get our cover crop planted and growing. We use multiple different species. You can use anywhere from 3 species in a blend on our cover crops all the way up to 9 species in a blend. It all depends on the crop that we're planting behind, the crop that we will be planting to the next year, and also our planting date. The earlier we can get our cover crops planted gives us the ability to plant more species. because we'll have a growing season. You get later on into the fall, some of the species we could plant earlier just aren't going to have enough growing season to really flourish and do much. A prime example would be radishes, and buckwheat. Radishes typically freeze out somewhere around Christmas for us, so if you plant them in November, they just don't have much of a growing season. Buckwheat, first frost will kill buckwheat, so it doesn't make sense to plant it in mid-October if we're forecast to get a frost in the next week. But if we plant those cover crops in September after our corn harvest, they have a chance to flourish and actually benefit the soil. Now, typically, behind a cotton crop that we're going straight into soybeans without winter wheat, on typically our wetter ground, going into soybeans is a legume. It produces its own nitrogen, so we don't need to add a cover crop species that produces nitrogen, because if there's residual nitrogen in the soil from that cover crop, the soybeans themselves could kind of get lazy and not produce their own nitrogen, which could lead to decreased yield. Behind a cotton crop in front of a soybean crop, we don't include any legumes, but we will plant a lot of grasses, and if the calendar allows, we will have some brassicas in there like rapeseed and radish. And then, say behind our corn crop that's going into a cotton crop the next year, that's typically when we'll plant our most species, because it's getting planted earlier in the year. We'll plant grasses, we'll plant legumes, and we'll plant some brassicas. Now, behind a soybean crop or a double crop soybean crop that's going into corn the next year, corn's a really big user of nitrogen. We don't want the residue from the cover crop to tie up any nitrogen the following year, so we will lower our grass rate, because it takes nitrogen to decompose residue, especially grass that has a high carbon to nitrogen ratio. We'll lower the rates of grass, but we'll really bump up the rates of the legumes, so we can get some extra nitrogen production for the corn. It will lower the carbon to nitrogen ratio of the whole cover crop, which will allow it to decompose faster, thus returning the nutrients to the soil that the corn crop can then use. Because corn, starting about V5, it needs a steady, big stream of nitrogen in order to produce maximum yield. And if your grasses are too abundant or get too big, a lot of the microbes will be using that nitrogen in the soil to try and decompose the residue, and it will actually be starving the corn plants from that. So anyway, that's kind of a very broad, generic overview of our cover crop system. If you have any further questions about it, feel free to leave another question below. All right, now we're going on to the questions from the very first Ask the Farmer episode. Got this question from Bailey Farms Gaming. He asked, if someone were to ask for tips on starting a farm from scratch, what would be the best tips you would give them? Well, Bailey, I plan on doing an entire video on this subject at some point, probably this winter, going more in detail, but to give you kind of a brief overview of what I think I would do. There's a common saying around here, there's two ways to become a farmer. Either you're born into it or you marry into it. And that's for the simple fact that the overhead that you need to get into row crop farming is tremendous. In order to farm a farm all yourself and not have to custom hire out some help, you need to own a lot of different pieces of equipment, and a lot of that equipment you'll only use for maybe a week out of the entire year. It's not like a factory where you can buy one piece of equipment and it will do a job all year long. You really only need to plow the land. If you plow, you really only need to plow the land one time during the year. You only need to plant it one time a year, or worst case scenario, if you have to replant it 2 times a year. Now tractors, you can use them pretty much throughout the year to do different tasks, but the implements behind them, you'll generally only use them one time. A harvest machine, whether it be a combine or cotton picker, you'll only use it one time throughout the year. So it's extremely difficult, not impossible, but there's a lot of circumstances that have to fall in line in order to be able to start a row crop farming operation from scratch. One of my former employees, a real close friend, he actually started his own operation from scratch. But he was able to do it because there was a person that owned quite a bit of ground that wanted him specifically to farm that ground. He was able to get started by buying a tractor and a planter and a sprayer, and then he had a lot of other stuff custom done the first year or two, and then as he grew, he slowly added more and more pieces of equipment, which lowered his requirements for getting people to come custom spray or do whatever for him. But it's been a very long road, but he's been very successful at it because he's a good farmer. He's got real good business sense. My advice on how to get into row crop farming yourself, if you were to do it, I think the best way would be to find a farmer who was needing help, preferably a good farmer, that's not about to get out in the next year or two. You know, he's not about to retire in the next year or two. Get a job with his farm. You know, hopefully you're able to negotiate maybe a salary wage rather than a per hour wage. That's how we prefer to operate, is to pay employees salary rather than hourly. It's one less thing I've got to keep up with, and they generally seem happy. But in lieu of part of your salary, you know, see if that farmer can maybe give you a 20-acre field to start out on, to treat as your own, and the income you would get off of that 20 acres would be part of your salary. You know, you make all the decisions on it, and in return, the farmer lets you use his equipment on that 20 acres without, without any charge. You know, if I would not have a problem doing that for somebody to help give them a start in farming. That way you can get started and see what it's like to actually grow a crop without having to invest the thousands and thousands of dollars it takes to get the equipment to grow that crop. All you'd be responsible for is your labor and your direct input cost, your seed, your fertilizer, and your chemicals. And then as that relationship with your employer develops, you know, maybe try to pick up a little bit more extra ground on your own. You know, another 20 acres here, or 30 acres there, or whatnot, and slowly grow that operation. And, you know, it can really supplement your salary. You'd be working for the farmer at below market value, but you'd be gaining valuable experience and extremely valuable help in getting your own operation started. And then eventually, you know, a lot of farmers are, you know, around between 60 and 62 years old. They might only be farming another 5 or 10 years. And a lot of them, the farm will end with them because they don't have children wanting to come back and run the farm. And then, you know, by that time, hopefully you've gained enough valuable experience. You really know what you're doing a little bit better. Hopefully one day, maybe then you can either buy the farm from that, buy the farming operation from that person and be able to take it over. Or maybe, you know, work out some kind of a lease program where you rent his ground from him, and then you make yearly payments on the farming operation until it's able to be paid off. I think something like that would be the best route and the less risky route. Now, that being said, I mean, you got to find the right person to work with, which might not necessarily be the easiest thing to do, but it's definitely a lot less risky than trying to pick up ground on your very own when you're not known and you really don't know what you're doing. Trying to pick up ground and then go to the bank, borrow all the money you need to invest in the equipment, and then hope and pray that you don't have a crop failure and you actually got enough income to pay all of these expenses. And best case scenario, maybe have a little bit of extra money in your pocket to put towards your operation and build on next year. Again, it's extremely difficult to do, but I think that would be, the way I described it, would be the safest, least risky, and have the best chances of success to do it that way. So, but anyway, I'll do a full video on this later on with a lot of other things that a first-time farmer would need to consider or look for when trying to start their farm. Next question is from Paul Lukasevich. Sorry, I know I butchered that. But anyway, he says, I noticed your corn crop is quite tall. Back in the late 60s and early 70s, there was a move to grow tall corn for silage and shorter corn for grain, and specific seed varieties were developed. The theory was that energy should go into growing the ear, not the stalk, if you wanted grain. Do you have any idea what happened to that theory? Paul, that's a great question. And you talk to different seed manufacturers and you'll get two different theories. I'll take the two most popular ones in the U.S. that I'm aware of. You have DeKalb and you have Pioneer. Those are probably the most well-known, at least here in our area. In the Midwest might be a little bit different, but in our area, DeKalb and Pioneer are the two principal seed companies. Pioneer is historically known for having tall corn with a long ear that's typically a little bit skinnier, whereas DeKalb is known for more of a shorter plant, more compact plant, and more girthy ears, but a little bit shorter. Now, the thinking behind Pioneer that I've been told, and I agree with it, is that you typically want a taller plant because later in the season, a corn plant's roots cannot take up all the nutrients it requires for maximum yield. It just can't pull it out of the soil. Sometimes that's just because the nutrient demands are greater than what the roots can handle. Also, you get into late season, the soils might be drier and the corn plant has to work harder to extract the moisture and nutrients it requires from the soil. But for maximum demand with the high yielding hybrids that we have nowadays, the corn plant roots just cannot supply enough nutrients late season. And as a result, the corn plant, in order to produce maximum yield, has to start cannibalizing itself in order to take energy from other parts of the plant and put it into the ear. That's why on a corn plant, you'll see the lower leaves turn yellow and die, because it's pulling nutrients out of that leaf, whether it be nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, other stuff. It'll pull nutrients out of those lower leaves that's really not contributing to yield, and it will translocate them into the stalk and into the ear. Also, the corn stalk, it will cannibalize the corn stalk. That's why corn is more of a risk of late season storms, because the stalk is a lot weaker, because it's taking a lot of nutrients out of that stalk and put it into the ear. Now, the theory is that helps on yield, because the taller the stalk you got, well, the more storage capacity of nutrients you have. You essentially have a bigger gas tank to be able to supply that longer. Now, I don't know if scientifically if that's right or not, but that kind of makes sense to me. Now, DeKalb, even though it's got a little bit shorter stalk, I mean, they've got some great varieties and they make some big yields too. So again, I don't know who's right and who's wrong, but that's the theory behind it. Hope that answers your question. All right, we'll try and get 2 more quick questions and comments in here. Next one is from Jamar Smith. He says, turn this whole Ask the Farmer into a podcast. I will listen to it. Keep up the good work. Jamar, I know there's other farmers that have been very successful with a podcast, but me personally, I don't think it would be a good option for me, because I don't know if I've admitted this on video, but I have a pretty bad stuttering problem. And in fact, it's gotten a lot better the last year or so, but 2-3 years ago, it was almost impossible for me to form a complete sentence. And even now, I get hung up on words and sentences, and I'll stutter trying to get it out. And that's the magic behind these videos I produce. I can go back and I can edit that part out to kind of make it seem like a cohesive video. So if I were to do a podcast and talking on the phone, or talking into, or just talking into a microphone where I'm not actually looking at anything, that seems to bring the stuttering on even more. And I just don't think it would be a good option for me. I don't think it would be all that enjoyable for a listener, because sometimes it can be pretty brutal. I mean, some of the phone conversations I've had with people have not gone well just because they couldn't follow me because I was stuttering so bad. And I have good days, I have bad days, and sometimes it can rear its ugly head just at a moment's notice, and it could ruin a whole episode. So that's kind of why I like this video format. It just seems to work better, and then if I do have problems with my speech, I can go back and edit it out. But good idea, just don't think it's right for me. Last question is going to be a quick one from Jay Downer. He asks, what crops do you farm and how many acres are there? Well, Jay, we farm 4 principal crops: wheat, corn, soybeans, and cotton. And, total our farm size this year is just a hair over 1,600 acres. Last year it was about 2,000 physical acres that we actually worked. Now, when you count wheat and double crop soybeans following behind it, we grow about 2,100 acres of crop off 1,600 physical acres, because we're getting 2 crops on an acre in a year. So we try to keep it roughly a third between cotton, corn, and wheat with double crop soybeans. We don't have all that many full season soybeans. I think this year we've got 130, 140 acres, because it's much more possible to plant wheat and double crop soybeans with our yield potential here than it is just to plant one single crop of soybeans. But we typically plant a single crop of soybeans on ground that's too wet to plant winter wheat on. So that's kind of our crop. That's our crop mix. We typically don't go whole hog into one crop in one year trying to chase a high price, because I just don't think that's good risk management. And some years you go whole hog in that one crop, the price might be good, but it might not be a good growing year for that crop, and you might have a disaster of a yield. Whereas if you planted another crop, if you stuck with your rotation, your risk would have been spread much more out, and some of those other crops might have had a chance to flourish when your primary crop that you were chasing, you know, whereas it actually failed. That's kind of our theory behind the crops, and that's the crop our plants. Anyway, guys, I guess that's going to close it out. I got to get back out here in the sun, got more pigweed. So, guys, I really appreciate y'all watching. Y'all have had some fantastic questions. Love doing this. Might only get 1 or 2 more episodes of this in before we start recording our fall harvest. Then we might have to put this series on hold a little bit until the winter months. But please, if you have any questions about us personally, our farm, agriculture in general, maybe what you see on farms in your neck of the woods, what you see on the news, if you have any questions about any of that, please drop it in the comments below. And I promise at some point I will get to it. Might be this winter before I get to it, but I promise I'll get to it. Anyway, guys, keep the questions coming. I love doing these episodes. I love trying to educate the public about what we do, about the facts out there, not propaganda or anything like that. So guys, enjoyed it. We'll see you again in the next one.